The leather booth was cold beneath her trembling fingers as she watched him count the bills with slow precision, his ringed hand moving like a predator's last warning. $47 exactly. He left nothing. Not a single coin. The other men at his table laughed, their expensive suits and dangerous eyes watching her like wolves circling wounded prey, but he never smiled. He just looked at her with those dark Italian eyes that seemed to strip away every defense she'd ever built, and something in her chest cracked open, raw and terrifying, as if her soul recognized something in him that her mind couldn't name yet. Welcome to Mafia Home Tale, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Olivia stood frozen beside the table, her worn apron twisted between her fingers as the reality settled over her like ice water. She'd served them perfectly, smiled through their crude jokes, refilled their whiskey without being asked, and somehow she'd still failed. The $0 tip felt like a slap, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of men like these. She forced her voice to stay steady even as her hands shook. "Thank you for dining with us tonight," she said quietly, gathering the empty plates with as much dignity as she could salvage. The dark-haired man in the center, the one who'd paid, tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her skin burn. He didn't speak. He just watched her walk away, and she felt his gaze on her back like a brand. Later that night, after her shift ended and the restaurant fell into darkness, Olivia sat in her small apartment and counted her tips for the third time, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. $43 total for a double shift. Not enough for the electric bill. Not enough for groceries. Definitely not enough for her mother's medication that she'd promised to pick up tomorrow. She pressed her palms against her eyes and told herself she wouldn't break, but the tears came anyway, hot and angry and so damn tired. She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway outside her door. She didn't know that the man from the restaurant had followed her home, that he stood on the other side of her cheap wooden door with his hand raised to knock, his jaw clenched with something that looked almost like regret. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the restaurant early and found an envelope taped to her locker. Her name was written across it in sharp, elegant handwriting that didn't belong to anyone she knew. Inside was $5,000 in cash and a note that simply read, "For your exceptional service." The world tilted. She looked around the empty break room, her heart hammering against her ribs, but no one was there. No explanation. No name. Just money she desperately needed and a creeping sense that something had shifted in her life, something she couldn't control or understand. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt terrified. A few days later, he came back. Same table. Same dangerous men flanking him like soldiers. But this time, when Olivia approached with her notepad and her practiced smile, he stood up. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. He was taller than she remembered, broader, with the kind of presence that made other men step aside without thinking. "Your name," he said, his accent rolling through the words like smoke. It wasn't a question. It was a command. "Olivia," she whispered, and hated how small her voice sounded. He repeated it slowly, tasting each syllable, and something in his dark eyes softened just enough to be dangerous. "Olivia. I'm Matteo. And you will never serve another table in this restaurant again." Before she could process his words, before she could ask what he meant or why he'd given her that money or how he even knew where she worked, the manager appeared at Matteo's side, practically bowing. "Mr. Salvatore," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "your usual table is ready whenever you are." Olivia's blood went cold. Salvatore. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. The Salvatore family controlled everything from the docks to the politicians, their empire built on violence and loyalty and secrets that got people killed. And she'd just told the head of that family her real name. That evening, Olivia was called into the manager's office and told she was being promoted. Private server for VIP clients only. Triple the pay. Her own section. She should have been thrilled, but all she felt was trapped. This was Matteo's doing. It had to be. He'd bought her somehow, rearranged her entire life with the same cold precision he'd used to count those bills and leave her nothing. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to walk out and never come back. But 3 months of unpaid rent and her mother's mounting medical bills made her a prisoner to survival. So she nodded. She accepted. And she pretended not to notice the way Matteo watched her from across the restaurant every single night after that, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. The following week, a man came into the restaurant and sat in her section. He was handsome in an obvious way, with styled hair and an expensive watch and the kind of smile that expected women to melt. He flirted shamelessly, asked for her number, told her she was too beautiful to be working in a place like this. Olivia laughed politely and deflected, but she could feel Matteo's stare burning into her from across the room. When she finally glanced his way, she saw murder in his eyes. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor loud enough to turn heads, and crossed the restaurant in 4 long strides. The conversation he had with the flirting man was brief and quiet, but when it was over, the stranger threw money on the table and practically ran for the exit, his face pale with fear. Matteo turned to Olivia then, his jaw tight and his hands clenched into fists at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "You don't smile at other men like that," he said, his voice low and rough. She stared at him, anger finally breaking through her fear. "I'll smile at whoever I want," she shot back. "You don't own me." The muscle in his jaw flexed. Something dark and possessive flashed across his face. "Yet," he said simply, and walked away, leaving her trembling with fury and something else she refused to name. By the end of the week, Olivia noticed the changes. Men stopped flirting with her. Customers who got too friendly were quietly escorted out. Even the other servers started keeping their distance, like she'd been marked by something they didn't want to touch. She confronted Matteo one night after closing, cornering him in the parking lot before he could slip into his black SUV. "What did you do?" she demanded. "What did you tell them?" He looked at her for a long moment, the streetlight casting shadows across his sharp features. "I told them the truth," he said quietly. "That you're mine. And anyone who doesn't respect that will answer to me." Her breath caught. She should have been furious. She should have slapped him. Instead, her traitorous heart stuttered in her chest, and she hated herself for it. That night, Olivia lay awake and tried to make sense of what was happening. Matteo Salvatore was dangerous. He was violent. He controlled half the city through fear and money and blood. Everything logical told her to run, to quit her job, to disappear before she got pulled deeper into his world. But another part of her, the part that noticed how he always made sure she got to her car safely, how his eyes softened when he looked at her, how he'd paid for her mother's medication anonymously last week when the pharmacy suddenly called to say her bill was covered, that part wondered if maybe there was something else beneath the monster everyone else saw. Something that only she was allowed to witness. The next day, everything changed. Olivia was walking to work through the usual route, cutting through the alley behind the restaurant to save time, when 3 men stepped out of the shadows. They didn't say anything at first. They just surrounded her, their intentions clear in their predatory smiles. She opened her mouth to scream, but one of them grabbed her, his hand clamping over her lips. She fought. God, she fought. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong, and she felt herself being dragged toward a waiting van, terror clawing up her throat. Then she heard the gunshot. The man holding her dropped instantly, and suddenly Matteo was there, moving through her attackers like death itself, his gun steady and his face completely empty of mercy. It was over in seconds. 3 men lay bleeding on the ground, and Matteo was pulling Olivia against his chest, his hands running over her frantically, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice shaking in a way she'd never heard before. "Did they touch you? Tell me." She could only shake her head, her whole body trembling so violently she couldn't form words. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, carrying her to his SUV while barking orders into his phone in rapid Italian. She caught words like hospital and every man you can find and make them pay, but mostly she just focused on the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear and tried not to fall apart completely. Later that night, Olivia sat in Matteo's penthouse, wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than her car, while a private doctor examined her for injuries. Matteo stood across the room with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. She was fine. A few bruises. Nothing serious. But he looked like he wanted to burn down the entire city. When the doctor finally left, Matteo crossed to her slowly, kneeling in front of the couch where she sat. His hands were gentle when he reached for hers, so different from the violence she'd witnessed hours ago. "This was my fault," he said quietly. "They took you because of me. Because I claimed you and made you a target. I'm sorry, Olivia. I'm so fucking sorry." She should have agreed. She should have blamed him and demanded to go home and told him to stay away from her. But looking at this powerful, dangerous man kneeling at her feet with actual fear in his eyes, fear for her, something inside her shifted. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much? What am I to you?" He looked up at her, and the raw emotion in his expression stole her breath. "Everything," he said simply. "From the moment you looked at me in that restaurant and didn't flinch, didn't try to please me, didn't care that I could destroy you with a word, you became everything. And I know I have no right to feel this way. I know I'm poison for you. But I can't stay away. I've tried. God knows I've tried." Olivia's hand moved before her brain caught up, her fingers touching his jaw, feeling the rough stubble there. She should be running. Every instinct screamed at her to get away from this man and his violent world. But instead she leaned forward, and when their lips met, it felt like falling and flying at the same time. Matteo made a sound low in his throat, his control shattering as he pulled her closer, kissing her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. The world narrowed to just this, just them, just the desperate need that had been building between them since that first night. He lifted her, carrying her toward the bedroom, and she didn't stop him. She couldn't. She needed this. Needed him. Even if it destroyed her. The morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains when Olivia woke, alone in Matteo's massive bed. Her body ached in ways that made her blush, memories of the night before flooding back in vivid detail. His hands. His mouth. The way he'd whispered her name like a prayer. But he wasn't there. Panic seized her chest. Last night had been a mistake. He'd gotten what he wanted, and now he'd disappear, and she'd be left with a broken heart and a target on her back. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she searched for her shoes. She needed to leave before he came back. Before she had to see the regret in his eyes. Before he could say the words that would shatter her completely. She was halfway to the door when it opened. Matteo stood in the doorway holding a tray with coffee and pastries from her favorite bakery, the one 3 blocks from her apartment that she'd mentioned exactly once in passing. He froze when he saw her dressed and ready to bolt, something like devastation crossing his face. "You're leaving," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Olivia couldn't meet his eyes. "This was a mistake," she whispered. "We both know it. Last night was just adrenaline and fear and we weren't thinking clearly. It's better if I just go now before things get complicated." The tray hit the side table with a sharp crack. "Don't," Matteo said, his voice rough. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me what we shared meant nothing. Don't minimize it because you're scared." She finally looked at him, tears burning her eyes. "Of course I'm scared," she shot back. "You're Matteo Salvatore. You kill people. You run this city. You could have anyone you want, and for some reason you decided you wanted me, but what happens when you get bored? What happens when someone prettier or more interesting catches your eye? What happens when you realize I'm just a waitress who can't fit into your world? What happens when you leave?" He crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands cupping her face with desperate gentleness. "I will never leave you," he said fiercely. "I will never get bored. I will never want anyone else. You think this is temporary for me? You think I do this for every woman? Olivia, I have never brought anyone to this apartment. I have never let anyone close enough to matter. But you walked into my life and changed everything without even trying. You're not just anything to me. You're everything. Before she could respond, his phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again. And again. Finally he answered with a snarl, his eyes never leaving hers. What? She watched his expression change, watched him go from frustrated to cold and deadly in the span of a heartbeat. When, he demanded. How many? His jaw clenched. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Double the guard. No one gets close to her. He hung up and turned to Olivia, his hands gentle despite the violence she could see brewing beneath his skin. I have to go, he said quietly. There's a situation that requires my attention. But you're staying here where it's safe. I have men outside the door. You don't leave this apartment until I come back. Do you understand? Olivia wanted to argue. She wanted to demand answers. But the look in his eyes stopped her. This was the Matteo the world feared, the one who made grown men tremble. Promise me, he said again. Promise me you'll stay here. She nodded slowly. I promise. He kissed her then, hard and possessive and laced with something that felt like desperation. I'll come back to you, he whispered against her lips. I'll always come back to you. Then he was gone, and she was alone in the penthouse with her racing thoughts and the growing certainty that she'd just fallen completely and irrevocably in love with the most dangerous man in the city. The hours crawled by like torture. Olivia paced the penthouse, her mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. She tried Matteo's phone 3 times, but it went straight to voicemail. The guards outside the door wouldn't tell her anything except that Mr. Salvatore had the situation under control. By the time the sun started setting, painting the city in shades of orange and red that looked too much like blood, she was ready to climb the walls. Then she heard shouting in the hallway. Gunshots. The sound of bodies hitting the floor. Her heart stopped. The door burst open, and for one terrible second she thought it was over, thought Matteo's enemies had found her. But it was him, covered in blood that she prayed wasn't his eyes wild as they found her across the room. Matteo crossed to her in 3 long strides, his hands running over her face, her shoulders, her arms, like he needed to confirm she was real. They knew, he said, his voice rough. They knew you were here. They came for you. His men had held them off, but barely. The attack had been coordinated, professional, designed to draw Matteo away so they could take what mattered most to him. Olivia felt the reality crash over her like a wave. This was her life now. Constant danger. Always looking over her shoulder. Never safe. She opened her mouth to tell him she couldn't do this, that it was too much, but he spoke first. I'm sending you away, he said quietly. Somewhere they can't find you. Somewhere safe. You'll have everything you need. Money, protection, a new identity if necessary. But you have to leave tonight. The words hit her like a physical blow. You're leaving me, she whispered. After everything you said this morning, you're just going to ship me off somewhere and forget about me. Matteo's expression cracked. Never, he said fiercely. God, Olivia, never. I'm trying to keep you alive. Don't you understand? As long as you're connected to me, you're in danger. My enemies will use you to get to me. They'll hurt you just to watch me break. I can't let that happen. I won't. So yes, I'm sending you away, because loving you means protecting you, even if it destroys me. She stared at him, her heart shattering and mending all at once. You love me, she said softly. He closed his eyes like the confession caused him physical pain. More than my own life, he admitted. More than anything. Olivia made her decision in that moment. She stepped forward, taking his blood-stained hands in hers. Then teach me, she said firmly. Teach me how to survive in your world. Teach me how to protect myself. Give me a gun, combat training, whatever I need. But don't send me away. Don't make that choice for me. I'm terrified, Matteo. I'm so scared I can barely breathe sometimes. But I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of your enemies. So let me stay. Let me fight. Let me choose you the way you chose me. He looked at her like she'd just offered him salvation and damnation wrapped in the same package. You don't know what you're asking, he said roughly. My world is blood and violence and darkness. Once you're in, there's no going back to normal. She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes steadily. I don't want normal, she said. I want you. The kiss was inevitable, desperate, filled with everything they couldn't say out loud. Matteo pulled her against him like he could merge their bodies into one, like he could keep her safe through sheer force of will. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Okay, he whispered. Okay. You stay. But on my terms. You learn everything. You never take unnecessary risks. And if I tell you to run, you run. No questions. No arguments. She nodded against him. Deal. That night, Matteo made a series of phone calls that would reshape the city's underworld. Anyone who'd been involved in the attack on Olivia was marked for death. The message was clear: touch what belonged to Matteo Salvatore, and you'd pray for a quick end that would never come. The following morning, Olivia's training began. Matteo's head of security, a terrifying woman named Lucia who looked like she could kill someone with a paperclip, took charge of her education. Hand-to-hand combat. Weapons training. Situational awareness. How to spot a tail. How to identify exits. How to survive if she was taken. It was brutal and exhausting, and Olivia discovered muscles she didn't know existed. But she didn't quit. Every bruise, every aching joint, every moment she wanted to give up, she thought about Matteo and pushed through. He watched her sometimes from the sidelines, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with something that looked like pride and fear mixed together. A few weeks later, Olivia accompanied Matteo to a charity gala, her first public appearance as his. She wore a dress he'd had custom-made, midnight blue silk that hugged her curves and made her feel like someone else entirely. Someone confident. Someone who belonged on the arm of a man like him. The other guests stared, whispered behind their hands, wondered who the mystery woman was that had captured the attention of the city's most eligible and dangerous bachelor. Matteo kept her close all night, his hand possessive on her lower back, his eyes tracking every man who looked at her too long. She should have felt objectified. Instead, she felt cherished. Protected. Claimed in a way that sent heat pooling low in her stomach. But then she saw her. A woman, stunning and sophisticated, with the kind of pedigree that screamed old money and power, approaching them with a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. Matteo, she purred, kissing both his cheeks in the European style. It's been too long. Her gaze slid to Olivia, dismissive and cutting. And who is this? Before Matteo could respond, the woman continued. Let me guess. Another charity case. You always did have a savior complex, darling. Remember when you thought you could fix me? Olivia felt the barb land, felt the implication that she was temporary, forgettable, just another project for Matteo to grow bored with. But Matteo's arm tightened around her waist. Isabella, he said coldly, let me make something very clear. Olivia is not a charity case. She's the woman I intend to marry. The woman I would burn this entire city down for. And if you ever disrespect her again, you'll find out exactly how far my savior complex extends when it comes to protecting what's mine. The color drained from Isabella's face. She stammered something that might have been an apology and fled. Olivia stood frozen, her mind stuck on one word. Marry. Matteo had said marry. In public. In front of witnesses. He looked down at her, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. Too soon, he asked quietly. She shook her head slowly. No, she whispered. Not soon enough. The smile that crossed his face was pure joy, so rare and genuine that it transformed him completely. He pulled her onto the dance floor, and as they swayed together under glittering chandeliers, Olivia felt like maybe, just maybe, she could survive this life. This love. This beautiful, terrifying thing they were building together. That evening, when they returned to the penthouse, Matteo disappeared into his study for what he said would be just a few minutes. An hour passed. Then 2. Olivia finally went looking for him and found him sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, a file folder open in front of him. The photos spilling from it made her blood run cold. Pictures of her. At work. Walking to her car. Entering her apartment. Some were weeks old. Some were from yesterday. Someone had been watching her long before the attack, documenting her life with disturbing precision. "Matteo," she said softly. He looked up, and the anguish in his eyes nearly broke her. "This is what I brought into your life," he said hoarsely. "This violation. This fear. You can't even walk down the street without being watched now. Documented. Targeted. What kind of man does that to the woman he loves?" Olivia crossed to him, taking the photos and deliberately dropping them in the trash. "The kind of man who's honest about the cost," she said firmly. "The kind of man who doesn't hide the darkness but stands in it with me. I know what I signed up for, Matteo. I'm not some naive girl who thinks love conquers all. I know your world is dangerous. I know there will be more attacks, more threats, more nights like this. But I also know that you would die before you let anyone hurt me. And that's enough. That has to be enough." He pulled her into his lap, burying his face against her neck. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. She smiled against his hair. "Probably not. But you're stuck with me anyway." The next few months passed in a blur of violence and tenderness, danger and domesticity. Matteo's enemies tested him repeatedly, trying to find weaknesses in his armor. But Olivia was no longer a weakness. She'd become a strength, someone who understood his world and chose to stand beside him anyway. She learned to read his moods, to know when he needed silence or conversation, to spot the signs that violence was coming and prepare accordingly. And Matteo, for his part, learned to let her in. To share the burdens he'd carried alone for so long. To accept that strength could come in different forms, and sometimes the bravest thing was admitting you needed someone. But their peace was shattered one night when Olivia received a call. Her mother had collapsed. Heart attack. The hospital wasn't sure she'd make it through the night. Olivia felt her world tilt. Matteo found her sitting on the bathroom floor, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, and he didn't say a word. He just gathered her up, carried her to the car, and drove to the hospital himself. No guards. No security. Just him and her and the desperate need to get there in time. When they arrived, he stayed in the waiting room while Olivia went to her mother's bedside. The woman was weak but alive, tubes and monitors surrounding her, and when she saw Olivia her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For being such a burden. For making you work so hard. You deserve so much more than this life gave you." Olivia held her mother's hand and told her everything. About Matteo. About the danger and the love and the impossible choice she'd made to stay. She expected judgment. She expected fear. But her mother just smiled weakly. "Does he make you happy?" she asked. "Despite everything. Despite the fear. When you're with him, are you happy?" Olivia thought about Matteo's rare smiles. His protective nature. The way he looked at her like she hung the stars. "Yes," she admitted. "More than I ever thought possible." "Then that's all that matters," her mother said. "Life is too short and too hard to waste on anything less than extraordinary love. Hold on to him. Hold on to that joy. And don't let fear steal what you've found." It was the permission Olivia didn't know she needed, and when her mother finally drifted into medicated sleep, she walked back to the waiting room with new resolve. Matteo stood when she appeared, his expression tight with concern. She's going to be okay, Olivia said. And I need to tell you something. He nodded, waiting. I love you, she said simply. I know I've never said it out loud before. I know I've been scared to name it because naming it makes it real and real things can be lost. But I love you, Matteo Salvatore. I love your darkness and your light. I love your violence and your tenderness. I love the way you've changed my entire world. And I'm done being afraid to say it. His control shattered. He crossed to her in 2 strides, lifting her off her feet and kissing her with desperate relief. I love you, he said against her lips. God, Olivia, I love you so much it terrifies me. Marry me. Let me make this official. Let me give you my name and my protection and everything I am. Say yes. She laughed through happy tears. Yes, she said. Yes, yes, yes. The small crowd in the waiting room applauded, and even the exhausted nurses smiled at the display. Matteo produced a ring from his pocket, a stunning diamond that must have cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and slid it onto her finger like he was claiming her soul. You've been carrying that around, she asked, bemused. Since the day after you agreed to stay, he admitted. I've been waiting for the right moment. This seemed right. She kissed him again, softer this time, full of promise. It's perfect, she whispered. 2 months later, they married in a small private ceremony with only their closest friends and family present. Olivia's mother, recovered enough to attend, cried through the entire service. Matteo's associates, dangerous men who'd never seen their boss show weakness, looked at him with new respect when he recited his vows with tears in his eyes. The reception was held at his estate, fortified and guarded but beautiful, and when they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Olivia felt like maybe fairy tales could exist even in the darkest places. Later that night, alone in their bedroom, Matteo made love to her with reverent intensity, whispering promises against her skin about the life they'd build together. 6 months after the wedding, Olivia stood in the bathroom of their home, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Her hands shook. Her heart raced. She'd suspected for weeks but had been too afraid to confirm it. A baby. Their baby. Growing inside her in a world that was still so dangerous, so unpredictable. How could she bring a child into this? How could she risk it? She heard Matteo come home, heard him calling her name. She walked out to meet him, the test clutched in her trembling hand. His eyes found the small stick immediately, and she watched understanding dawn across his face. Are you, he started, his voice catching. Is that? She nodded, unable to speak. He crossed to her slowly, like she might shatter if he moved too fast. A baby, he whispered, his hand moving to her still flat stomach with wonder. Our baby. The tears came then, relief and fear mixing together. I'm scared, she admitted. What if something happens? What if you're enemies? What if I can't protect them? Matteo cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Nothing will happen, he said fiercely. I will burn this city to ash before I let anyone touch our child. You and this baby are my entire world now. Everything I've built, everything I've done, it all means nothing compared to keeping you both safe. I swear to you, Olivia. On my life. On my soul. Nothing will hurt our family. She believed him. God help her, she believed every word. They stood there together, holding each other and the fragile promise of new life, and Olivia felt something settle in her chest. Peace. After months of fear and violence and uncertainty, she finally felt at peace. The pregnancy was smooth, protected by layers of security that would have been suffocating if Matteo hadn't been so careful to give her space. He attended every doctor's appointment, his hand always finding hers during the ultrasounds, his eyes glued to the screen like he could keep their baby safe through sheer force of observation. When they found out it was a girl, Olivia watched the most dangerous man in the city cry with joy. A daughter, he kept repeating, his hands gentle on Olivia's growing belly. We're having a daughter. God help any boy who looks at her wrong. Olivia laughed and told him they had at least 16 years before they needed to worry about that, but secretly she loved his protective nature, loved that their daughter would grow up knowing she was cherished beyond measure. The labor came fast and hard one night, 3 weeks early. Matteo drove to the hospital with controlled panic, barking orders into his phone to have his best people secure the entire floor. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Olivia thought she couldn't do it, couldn't push through the pain. But Matteo was there, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, reminding her that she was the strongest person he'd ever met, and if anyone could do this, she could. And finally, after hours that felt like years, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that made both parents weep with relief. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair, and her father's eyes. Matteo held her with such careful reverence that Olivia fell in love with him all over again. They named her Sophia, after Matteo's grandmother who'd been the only person to show him kindness as a child. And as Olivia watched her husband cradle their daughter, singing to her in soft Italian while the dawn light streamed through the hospital windows, she thought about how far they'd come. From that first night in the restaurant when he'd left her nothing, testing her somehow without her knowledge, to this moment where they'd built everything together. The $0 tip had changed her life, had set in motion a series of events that led to the greatest love she'd ever known. She'd been furious at first, had felt disrespected and small. But now she understood. Matteo had been testing himself that night, seeing if he could walk away from the beautiful waitress who'd looked at him without fear. He'd failed. And thank God for that failure, because it had given them this. This impossible, beautiful, dangerous love. This family. This life. Later that day, when the visitors had left and Sophia slept peacefully in her bassinet, Matteo climbed into the hospital bed beside Olivia, careful not to jostle her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For staying when you should have run. For loving me when I gave you every reason not to. For giving me a family I never thought I deserved. You've made me better, Olivia. You've made me want to be better." She turned to look at him, this man who'd turned her world upside down and then rebuilt it into something extraordinary. "You've made me braver," she said softly. "You've shown me that love doesn't have to be safe to be real. That sometimes the most worthwhile things are the ones that scare us most. I don't regret a single moment. Not the danger. Not the fear. Not any of it. Because every moment led me here. To you. To her. To us." Matteo kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promises about the future they'd build together. A future where their daughter would grow up surrounded by love and protection, where Olivia would stand beside him as an equal partner in his empire, where the darkness they'd survived together would make the light that much brighter. Outside the window, the city sprawled before them, dangerous and beautiful and theirs. And in that hospital room, surrounded by the family they'd fought so hard to create, Olivia and Matteo began the next chapter of their extraordinary story, knowing that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Always together. Forever.